Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So imagine standing in a city where the central government is actively collapsing all around you.
Right, just total chaos.
Yeah, total chaos. Warlords are burning the agricultural fields. Corruption is literally the only reliable currency. And the local duke is sitting there calculating how much more he can tax a starving population without sparking a violent riot.
Which is a terrifying scenario.
Terrifying, right? And you would expect the ultimate survival guide written for this exact era to be all about military strategy or fortification or these Machiavellian power grabs. But instead, the survival guide we are looking at today tells you that the key to saving the world is straightening your sitting mat, refusing to wear the color purple, and absolutely eradicating your own ego.
Yeah, it's quite a pivot.
It's massive. We are diving deep into books 9 through 12 of the Analects of Confucius, and our mission for you today is to decode why this ancient text insists that macroscopic political survival depends entirely on microscopic personal habits.
I mean, it is a massive paradigm shift. When you approach these specific books, you really have to throw out your modern assumptions about power and influence.
Because we think so differently now.
We do. We tend to separate the internal world of the mind from the external world of politics and career. We think, I can be a chaotic mess internally, but as long as I pull the right levers of power externally, I will succeed. But this text fundamentally rejects that division.
It just doesn't buy it.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It argues that if the internal machinery of human character is broken, every external action you take, even with the best intentions, honestly is ultimately just performance that will inevitably cause harm.
Okay, let's unpack this, because looking at this text, I see an incredibly robust operating system for the human mind. The text focuses really heavily on what is translated as perfect virtue, the concept of Ren.
Right, Ren, a huge concept.
Yeah, and in Book 12, his favorite disciple, Yen Yuan, comes up and asks him to define this perfect virtue. The master replies, "To subdue oneself and return to propriety is perfect virtue."
It's such a dense sentence.
It is. So let's use an analogy here for the listener. If we think of the human mind as a computer, the subduing of self is like the core code, right? It's the background processing that restricts the ego. And propriety, which is the concept of Li, the manners, the rituals, the right action, that is the user interface.
I like that.
It's how that internal code physically interacts with the network of other human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, does the text support taking the analogy that far?
Oh, it absolutely supports that framework. And what's fascinating is how Yen Yuan responds to this.
How so?
Well, he doesn't just nod at the philosophy and walk away. He essentially asks for the specific programming syntax. He says, I beg to ask the steps of that process. How do I actually run this code?
Give me the manual.
Exactly. And the master gives him 4 incredibly strict parameters. He says, look not at what is contrary to propriety. Listen not to what is contrary to propriety. Speak not what is contrary to propriety. Make no movement which is contrary to propriety.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here, because modern psychology would have an absolute field day with this.
Oh, sure.
Subduing the self and this hypervigilant restriction of looking, listening, and speaking sounds a lot like boundary collapse,
Yeah, it sounds restrictive.
Right. We are taught today that we need our egos to function. We need a strong sense of self to avoid becoming a doormat. Isn't this ruthless eradication of the ego just a recipe for losing your identity entirely?
I mean, that is the exact friction point for a modern reader. It's where we usually get on the bus. But we have to clarify the mechanism of the ego, as Confucius understood it here.
Okay, clarify that for me.
He is not talking about destroying your core identity or your psychological boundaries. He is specifically targeting the selfish, dominating, self-aggrandizing impulse that creates social friction.
The friction.
Right. Think about the mechanics of human interaction. When you walk into a room needing to prove you are the smartest person there, your ego acts as a massive friction generator.
You stop listening.
You stop listening, you become defensive, you interrupt people. The text is saying that to achieve Ren, or perfect virtue, you have to eliminate that specific friction. It's not about becoming a doormat. It's about becoming perfectly frictionless so you can navigate complex social networks without causing damage.
Wow. Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
It's not about erasing the self. It's about getting the self out of its own way.
Precisely.
And we actually see the exact symptoms of this friction listed in Book 9. The text explicitly names 4 things the master was entirely free from. It says he was free from foregone conclusions, arbitrary predeterminations, obstinacy, and egoism.
And notice how all four of those are essentially cognitive biases.
Exactly. I mean, if you walk into a negotiation with an arbitrary predetermination, you're blind to new information.
Right, you've already decided the outcome.
Yeah, and if you are obstinate, you cannot adapt. He's essentially describing extreme cognitive flexibility here. And what's brilliant is how we see this play out in the physical world.
It's not just theory for him.
No, it doesn't make him a rigid robot. In fact, it makes him surprisingly pragmatic. Like, look at the story of the silk cap in Book 9.
Oh, that is a perfect case study in the difference between practical adaptation and moral compromise.
Yeah, so for the listener, the traditional rule of ceremony, part of that lin we talked about, dictates that a gentleman must wear a cap made of linen. But the master notes that in his current day, everyone is wearing silk caps because the material is more economical.
It just makes more sense.
Right. And he doesn't throw a traditionalist temper tantrum about it. He simply says, I follow the common practice. He adapts. It makes economic sense. It harms no one, so he changes the rule.
And this is key, we have to look at the second half of that exact same passage. It's the contrast that reveals the mechanism of his philosophy.
Right, because in the very next breath, he discusses the ritual of bowing to the ruler. The traditional rule is to bow below the hall, like before you ascend the stairs to speak to the ruler. But the new common practice is that people are skipping the first bow, walking up the stairs, and only bowing once they are on the same level as the ruler.
It's a subtle shift, but an important one.
Huge shift. And here, he absolutely refuses to follow the crowd. He says, that is arrogant. I continue to bow below the hall, though I oppose the common practice.
So why does he yield on the fabric of the hat, but hold the line on the stairs?
Yeah, what's the difference?
It's because of the psychological mechanics of the action. Changing the fabric from linen to silk, that's just a material convenience. It does not alter your internal character.
Right.
But changing the physical act of respect, elevating your physical body to the ruler's level before you acknowledge them, that physically reinforces psychological arrogance. It feeds the exact ego he is trying to subdue.
Wow.
He fundamentally understands that embodied actions shape internal states. If you act arrogantly with your body, your mind will follow.
That is so profound. That physical action bowing below the hall is the UI, the user interface, reflecting the internal code of humility.
Exactly.
But, it is one thing to practice humility when you are debating hat fabrics in a peaceful academy. It is another thing entirely to practice this when your life is on the line.
Very true.
I think it's crucial we anchor this philosophy in its actual historical reality. Because reading this, you could easily mistake Confucius for like a serene guru meditating in a tranquil garden, just giving unsolicited philosophical advice.
Which is how pop culture often portrays him, right?
Exactly. But the world of the spring and autumn period was incredibly violent.
It was a world in systemic, cascading failure. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Zhou dynasty, which had held the societal structure together for centuries, had completely fractured.
Falling apart.
You had proxy states constantly at war, massive corruption, and systemic breakdown. This was an era defined by violence, displacement, and profound instability. This wasn't armchair philosophy, this was survival. His insistence on virtue was a radical attempt to anchor a society that was literally tearing itself apart.
And Confucius himself is not insulated from this chaos. In Book 9's, there is a very raw, terse line. It just says, the master was put in fear in Kuang.
Yeah, that's a chilling moment.
The historical context here is that he was mistaken for a notorious warlord named Yang Hu, and the people of Kuang essentially surrounded him, threatening his life. He is trapped. He's facing imminent physical violence.
A lynch mob, essentially.
Right, a literal mob.
Right.
And yet, the psychological mechanism he uses to cope with this terror is just astounding.
How does he frame it in that moment?
Well, he doesn't panic, and he doesn't reach for a sword. He anchors his psychology in a cosmic timeline. He says, after the death of King Wan was not the cause of truth lodged here in me. If heaven had wished to let this cause of truth perish, then I should not have got such a relation to that cause.
It's an incredible mental pivot.
It is. And then he concludes, while heaven does not let the cause of truth perish, what can the people of Kuang do to me? He effectively bypasses his immediate physical terror by attaching his identity entirely to his mission.
It is a profound psychological defense mechanism. By outsourcing the ultimate success of his mission to Tian, to heaven, or the cosmic order, he completely neutralizes the power of his attackers.
He takes their power away.
Entirely. If the universe wants this philosophy to survive, a mob in Kuang cannot stop it. If the universe wants it to die, then his anxiety won't save it anyway. It allows him to remain perfectly centered in a situation that would break almost anyone else's mind.
But the threat isn't just mobs, it's the slow, grinding reality of economic collapse. Books 11 and 12 are littered with references to thieves, armies, and litigation.
The everyday miseries of a collapsing state.
Yeah, and there is a deeply revealing conversation between Duke A and the disciple Yuzo. The Duke is dealing with years of scarcity, which is a polite way of saying famine.
Right, massive crop failures.
And the Duke is trying to figure out if he can survive by taxing the starving people at 0.2% or 20% instead of the traditional 10%.
And we have to think about the mechanics of an agrarian economy in a famine here.
Put us in that reality.
Raising taxes from 10 to 20% isn't just a minor accounting adjustment for a modern middle-class family. For a peasant family already starving, that extra 10% literally means starvation. It means selling your children into slavery or resorting to banditry just to survive.
The stakes are life and death.
Absolutely.
And Yuzo tells the Duke, if the people have plenty, their prince will not be left to want alone. If the people are in want, their prince cannot enjoy plenty alone.
That is such a bold thing to say to a ruler.
It is. It's this stark reminder that the ruler and the ruled are a single organism. You cannot amputate the leg and expect the head to stay healthy.
And this intense environment takes a devastating human toll. We mentioned Yin Yuan earlier, the brilliant student who asked about the operating system of perfect virtue.
The one who wanted the programming syntax.
Right. Well, in Book 11, Yin Yuan dies prematurely.
Yeah. And the reaction from the master shatters the stereotype of the emotionless, snetic philosopher. The text says he bewails Yin Yuan exceedingly. He cries out, "Alas, heaven is destroying me, heaven is destroying me." It is incredibly visceral.
The other disciples are actually deeply unsettled by this.
They don't know what to do with it.
They tell him, "Master, your grief is excessive." They expect him to maintain that perfect, frictionless composure at all times. But he fires back, "If I am not to mourn bitterly for this man, for who should I mourn?"
So how do we reconcile that? If the goal is to subdue the self and maintain perfect propriety, how does screaming in agony over a death fit into the operating system?
Because lit propriety is not about the suppression of human emotion. That's a huge misconception.
Okay, then what is it?
It is about the appropriate expression of human emotion. To feel nothing when your greatest student and surrogate son dies is not virtue, it is psychopathy.
Right, you'd have to be a robot.
Exactly. True propriety demands that the depth of the grief matches the magnitude of the loss. His grief is perfectly aligned with reality. It proves that his philosophy isn't about detaching from humanity, but about engaging with it fully and authentically, bearing the absolute weight of love and loss.
That distinction changes everything. It's not detachment, it's profound, regulated attachment.
Exactly.
Now, taking this intense, chaotic reality of warlords, famines, and profound grief, let's pivot to how this ancient survival guide translates to our modern realities. Because while you and I might not be dodging warlords in Kwong today, we face our own modern versions of chaos, scarcity, and institutional breakdown.
Oh, without a doubt.
So what does this all mean for us? We have toxic corporate cultures, a massive crisis of public trust, and deep political polarization. Looking at this text, I can't help but see the wind and grass analogy in Book 12 as the ultimate diagnostic tool for organizational behavior.
It is one of the most enduring leadership metaphors in history. You should set the stage for that conversation.
Yeah, so a powerful political figure, Qi Kong, asks Confucius a terrifying question about governance. He asks, "What do you say to killing the unprincipled for the good of the principled?"
Just a casual question about mass execution.
Right. He essentially wants to know if he can just execute the toxic people to fix the culture. It is the ultimate authoritarian quick fix.
And, how many modern leaders, while obviously not executing people, use a sanitized version of this exact logic?
They'll fire them.
Yeah. If we just fire this department, if we purge this faction, the culture will be fixed.
Precisely. It's the belief that culture is fixed through violent excision. But Confucius shuts this down immediately. He says, "In carrying on your government, why should you use killing at all? Let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good."
And then comes the famous analogy.
Right, he drops the analogy. The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it.
Let's break down the mechanics of why that happens in a modern organization. Because this isn't just poetic imagery, it describes the sociological reality of human mirror neurons and social contagion.
How does that play out in an office?
In any hierarchical structure, the people at the bottom are constantly, subconsciously reading the micro behaviors of the people at the top to figure out what is actually rewarded.
So the stated values on the company website do not matter at all. The wind is what the CEO actually does.
Exactly. If the CEO preaches integrity in the newsletter, but promotes the guy who cuts ethical corners to hit quarterly targets, the CEO is generating a toxic wind. The employees, the grass, will immediately bend toward cutting corners because survival in that ecosystem requires it.
They adapt to the weather.
Yes. You don't have to kill or fire the bad behavior if you change the wind. If the leader acts with unwavering integrity, the organization naturally aligns. The burden of the culture is entirely on the atmospheric pressure created by the leader.
And that atmospheric pressure is ultimately built on one thing: trust, which leads to, honestly, the most radical thought experiment in the entire text.
Oh, the 3 pillars of government.
Yes. In Book 12, the disciple Sikorn asks about the absolute requisites of government. What does a state need to survive? Confucius gives him 3 pillars: sufficiency of food, sufficiency of military equipment, and the confidence of the people in their ruler. Food, weapons, and trust.
A very pragmatic list: economic security, national defense, and social cohesion.
But Sikorn pushes him. He says, if it cannot be helped, and one of these must be dispensed with, which of the 3 should be foregone first? Confucius says the military equipment. Give up the weapons.
Which is controversial, but understandable.
Right. If you have to choose between feeding your people and maintaining an army, you feed your people.
But Sikorn pushes the hypothetical to the absolute brink.
He really does. He says, if it cannot be helped, and one of the remaining 2 must be dispensed with, which of them should be foregone? You have to give up either the food or the trust. And Confucius's answer is staggering. He says, part with the food.
It sounds like madness to a modern ear. Part with the food. People will starve.
That is exactly what he says next. He says, from of old, death has been the lot of all men. But if the people have no faith in their rulers, there is no standing for the state. I want to dig into the mechanics of this because it is so counterintuitive.
It really is.
How can a state have no standing if its granaries are full but trust is gone?
Because without trust, the food doesn't matter. Think about the sociological mechanics of a society experiencing a crisis. If there is famine, but the people implicitly trust that the leadership is suffering with them, rationing fairly and doing everything possible to fix it, the society holds together.
They share what little they have.
Yes. But if the granaries are full, yet the people fundamentally believe the leaders are corrupt, hoarding the food or lying to them, the society instantly fractures. People will literally kill each other over the abundant food because the social contract has evaporated.
Trust is the only thing that makes the distribution of the food possible. We see this today. We obsess over economic metrics, the foods, but we are experiencing a massive crisis of institutional trust.
It's everywhere.
And this text warns us that a company or a nation can survive bankruptcy, it can survive a bad quarter, it can survive a pandemic. But the moment public trust evaporates, the entity is already dead.
It's a profound metric for any leader. You cannot buy trust with food, but you can weather a famine if you have trust.
Now, balancing out this macroscopic political theory, there is also incredibly sharp, almost modern career advice for the individual trying to navigate this chaotic world.
I love this part.
In Book 9, Sikorn, the same disciple who asked about the food and weapons, proposes another hypothetical. He says, there's a beautiful gem here. Should I lay it up in a case and keep it? Or should I seek for a good price and sell it?
And knowing Sikorn's personality, we know exactly what he's really asking.
Oh, he's talking about himself.
Yes.
He is the beautiful gem. He's essentially asking a career management question. I have cultivated massive talent and virtue. I am a highly skilled individual. Do I hide away in obscurity because the world is corrupt? Or do I sell out and take whatever job I can get just to have influence?
The eternal dilemma of the talented idealist.
And the master's reply is so enthusiastic and grounded. He says, sell it, but I would wait for one to offer the price. That is the ultimate career strategy.
It's brilliant. Cultivate your talents deeply. Be ready to offer them to the world.
But you do not compromise your integrity for a cheap price. You wait for the leader or the company or the opportunity that correctly values what you bring to the table.
It is the perfect antidote to both the modern imposter syndrome, where we hide our talents in a case, and the desperate hustle culture, where we sell ourselves to the lowest, most toxic bidder just to get on the board. You prepare relentlessly, and then you hold your boundaries.
But that begs the question, how does someone actually build that kind of character? We've talked about these massive concepts of subduing the ego, generating trust, holding career boundaries. But how did Confucius execute this on a random Tuesday?
The daily grind.
Exactly. If we look at Book X, it is entirely dedicated to the microscopic, hyperspecific daily habits of the master. And reading it, it sounds exactly like a modern biohacking manifesto or a high-end wellness retreat itinerary.
It really is a 2,500-year-old optimization protocol.
Let me read some of these habits because the level of detail is staggering. The text notes that he was never without ginger when he ate.
Good for digestion.
Right. He did not speak when eating, and he did not speak when in bed. When he ate meat, he rigorously controlled his portions so that the meat never exceeded the proportion of his rice. He wouldn't eat meat that wasn't cut properly or didn't have the correct sauce.
He was very particular.
And perhaps most famously, if his mat was not straight, he did not sit on it. Look at your own workspace or your own eating habits. What do they say about your internal state? Because to a casual reader, this looks like extreme obsessive-compulsive disorder. Why is the text elevating someone who throws a fit over a crooked sitting mat?
What's fascinating here is that it's not about the mat. We have to look at the neurobiology of embodied cognition.
Okay, break that down.
Modern psychology confirms what this ancient text intuitively grasped. Your physical environment and your physical actions relentlessly dictate your cognitive load. Straightening the mat before you sit down is a physical mechanism to induce mental order.
Explain how that mechanism works in the brain.
When you enter a chaotic environment, your brain has to subconsciously process all that visual noise, which drains cognitive resources. By enforcing microorder, straightening the mat, ensuring the meat is cut correctly, he is systematically removing environmental friction.
He's clearing the cats.
Yes. Furthermore, the act of straightening the mat forces a pause. It is an act of physical mindfulness. You cannot rush into a conversation if you first have to meticulously align your seating. Eating in silence, limiting heavy foods like meat, using ginger for digestion, these are all biomechanical strategies to ensure the physical body does not become a distraction to the mind. He is engineering his environment to support his operating system.
If the UI is glitchy, the code can't run. You can't have a chaotic desk, a terrible diet, and constant background noise, and then expect to effortlessly produce perfect virtue and deep intellectual work.
It's biologically impossible.
Which directly ties into how this text addresses mental health. There is a fascinating dialogue in Book 12 with a disciple named Sima Nu, who seems to be struggling with chronic anxiety. Sima Nu asks the master what constitutes a yunzi, a superior man, or a fully actualized human being.
And pay attention to the exact definition Confucius gives here, because it targets Sima Nu's specific psychological state.
The master says the superior man has neither anxiety nor fear. Sima Nu is incredulous. He asks, being without anxiety or fear, does this constitute what we call the superior man? Like, he can't believe it's that simple.
He's looking for a more complicated answer.
Right. And the master replies with the underlying mechanism. When internal examination discovers nothing wrong, what is there to be anxious about? What is there to fear?
That is a profoundly challenging diagnostic for modern anxiety.
How so?
Well, today, we often treat anxiety exclusively as a biochemical imbalance or a reaction to external stressors that are out of our control.
Right. We externalize the cause. I am anxious because the world is crazy.
But Confucius introduces a moral mechanism for anxiety. He is suggesting that a massive percentage of our baseline anxiety is actually moral friction. It is the subconscious hum of cognitive dissonance.
That's low-level guilt.
Exactly. It is the knowledge that we are cutting corners at work, that we are lying to our spouses, that we are neglecting our health, that our mat is not straight. When you live with low-level hypocrisy, your nervous system is constantly waiting to be found out. But when your internal examination reveals absolute integrity, when you know you have done everything in your power to act rightly, the psychological friction evaporates, the anxiety disappears because the ego has nothing to defend.
The peace of a clear conscience is the ultimate biohack. But what I appreciate is that Confucius didn't just prescribe a one-size-fits-all cure for this friction. He was hyper-aware that different people have different psychological baselines that require different interventions. This brings us to one of the greatest leadership moments in the text, found in Book 11.
The customized advice regarding action. This perfectly illustrates his diagnostic brilliance.
Yet, two different disciples ask him the exact same question, and he gives them completely contradictory answers. First, Zelu comes to him and asks, should I immediately carry into practice what I hear? Like, should I act immediately on a good idea?
And what does he say?
The master says, "There are your father and elder brothers to be consulted. Why should you act on that principle of immediately carrying into practice what you hear?" He tells him to slow down, consult, wait.
But then Zhan Yu comes and asks the exact same question.
Yes, Zhan Yu asks, "Should I immediately carry into practice what I hear?" And the master tells him, "Immediately carry into practice what you hear."
Total opposite answer.
Right. Another disciple, Kung Shi Hua, is watching this happen and is completely baffled. He asks the master, "Why did you just give them opposite instructions?"
Break down the master's explanation because it maps perfectly onto modern organizational psychology.
The master says, "Zhan Yu is retiring and slow. Therefore, I urged him forward. Zilu has more than his own share of energy. Therefore, I kept him back." He's treating the individual, not the symptom.
True practical wisdom requires you to know your own specific psychological baseline.
Exactly.
If your default setting is impulsive and energetic like Zilu, your daily practice must be artificially forcing yourself to delay and consult. You must engineer friction. But if your default setting is over-analytical and hesitant like Zhan Yu, you must eliminate friction and force immediate action.
It destroys the idea that fairness in leadership means treating everyone identically.
Yeah, if you manage a team and you force the overthinker to consult a committee, you will paralyze them. If you tell the impulsive maverick to act on their first instinct, they will burn the company down. You have to calibrate your leadership to the psychological architecture of the person in front of you.
That is incredibly practical. We can all identify if we are at Zilu or a Zhan Yu and correct our course. And here's where it gets really interesting. While self-correcting impulses and eating ginger are easy concepts for a modern audience to accept, we absolutely must address the obstacles to growth in this text.
The parts that make us uncomfortable.
Because if we are honest, there are parts of this ancient worldview that are going to deeply offend a modern listener. We have to confront the friction. Let's start with a highly controversial rule from Book 9. The master says, "Have no friends not equal to yourself."
Yeah, that is a grenade to modern sensibilities.
It really is. I mean, I have to challenge this. We live in a culture that champions radical egalitarianism, diversity of thought, and building wide social circles across all walks of life. Telling a listener today to have no friends not equal to yourself sounds impossibly elitist, exclusionary, and completely isolating. How is that not just ancient snobbery?
It absolutely sounds like snobbery until you understand the underlying mechanism of human nature that he is operating on. Modern culture assumes that the individual self is a fortress that you can interact with highly toxic or unprincipled people and remain perfectly untouched as long as your internal boundaries are strong.
We think we are immune to our environment.
Exactly. But Confucius believed the exact opposite. He believed that the human character is profoundly, dangerously porous. We are social sponges.
We soak it all up.
Yes. We inevitably absorb the moral baselines, the vocabularies, and the habits of the people we spend time with. This is social contagion theory. When he says not equal to yourself, he's not talking about financial equality, class status, or IQ. He is talking about moral aspiration.
Oh, so it's about trajectory, not status.
Yes. If you are desperately trying to cultivate Ren perfect virtue, and you surround yourself with an inner circle of friends who casually lie, who gossip, who are obstinate and ego-driven, they will drag your baseline down. You cannot maintain a straight mat in a room full of people throwing mud.
Wow, that's a great image.
It is the ancient articulation of the modern truism. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. It's not about isolating yourself from the world. It's about rigorously protecting the moral environment of your inner circle.
Okay, framing it around moral trajectory rather than social class definitely removes the elitism. It's about protecting the operating system from malware.
Perfect analogy.
But what about the microscopic rules of ceremony in Book X? Because it goes way beyond just who you hang out with. It gets into extreme theatrical rules regarding fashion and facial expressions that feel entirely performative.
Give me an example of the theatrics.
Okay, so the text dictates that he absolutely refused to wear a deep purple or a puce color.
No purple.
No purple. Over lamb's fur, he specifically wore a garment of black. Over fawn's fur, one of white, and over fox's fur, one of yellow. And his facial expressions were strictly regulated. When speaking with officers of a lower grade, he spoke freely but in a straightforward manner. With higher officers, he spoke blandly but precisely. When the ruler was present, his manner displayed respectful uneasiness.
So you're asking why he is micromanaging his face and his closet?
Yes. Today, we value authenticity over formality. If I respect you, it doesn't matter if I'm wearing sweatpants or a tuxedo. The internal feeling is what counts. But he seems obsessed with the external performance. Why all the rigid theatrics?
Because in his worldview, and particularly in the high context, largely illiterate society of ancient China, there is zero separation between internal character and external semiotics. The form is the substance.
Wait, explain that.
You say that if you respect someone, it doesn't matter if you wear sweatpants. But Confucius would argue that if you actually respected the magnitude of the occasion, your physical body would naturally compel you to dress appropriately. Showing up in sweatpants proves that your internal respect is actually defective.
Because you prioritized your own physical comfort over the dignity of the event.
Exactly. The ego creeping back in. Let's look at the ban on the color purple.
Yeah, why purple?
In ancient China, the 5 orthodox colors, red, yellow, blue, white, black, corresponded to the cosmic order. Purple was a mixed intermediate color. It represented the blurring of boundaries, the corruption of pure categories. By refusing to wear it, he wasn't just making a fashion statement. He was physically embodying his commitment to order over chaos.
He is broadcasting his philosophy through his clothes.
And his facial expressions are the same. Respectful uneasiness in front of the ruler isn't fear. It is the physical manifestation of understanding the gravity of state power. Every physical action, every color, every micro-expression is a vocabulary word. By controlling his body so precisely, he is constantly transmitting a signal of order, respect, and hierarchy into a world that is completely tearing itself apart.
I can appreciate the underlying mechanics of that. It transforms it from meaningless ritual into embodied respect. But we still face a significant problem. We are reading a 2,500-year-old text. We have to figure out what to keep and what to throw away.
This raises an important question.
Yeah, reading this text is like finding a 2,500-year-old recipe. We want to keep the core nutritional ingredients, but we definitely need to swap out the cooking methods, right? Because we aren't cooking over an open fire anymore. We need to practice wisdom with discernment.
Which is critical, because if we blindly endorse everything in this text, we end up adopting time-bound social assumptions that are incompatible with human flourishing today.
Right. For example, in Book X, there is a moment where the local villagers are performing ceremonies to drive away pestilential influences. They are literally trying to scare away evil spirits or disease. And the master puts on his court robes and stands on the eastern steps to participate. We don't need to adopt the literal animistic superstitions of the Zhou dynasty to appreciate the text.
Nor do we need to adopt the inherently patriarchal settings or the static, rigid class structures of ancient China. But the genius of discernment is finding the enduring psychological truth buried inside those ancient structures.
Let's apply that discernment to one of his most famous and potentially troubling definitions of government. In Book 12, Duke Cheng asks Confucius about government, and Confucius gives a perfectly symmetrical, incredibly rigid answer. There is government when the prince is prince and the minister is minister, when the father is father and the son is son.
On the surface, to a modern democratic ear, that sounds like the ultimate defense of the status quo.
It sounds like stay in your lane, know your place, don't ever question authority, and obey the hierarchy.
And historically, it has unfortunately been weaponized by authoritarian regimes to mean exactly that. But if we dig into the philosophical core, what scholars call Zenming, or the rectification of names, a completely different, radically subversive wisdom emerges.
Okay, explain the mechanics of the rectification of names.
The concept of Zenming asserts that titles and roles in society are not just empty linguistic labels, they carry inherent objective moral duties. The title of father implies a set of actions: protection, provision, guidance, love. If a biological male produces a child but abandons them, abuses them, or neglects them, he is not a bad father. Under Zenming, he's not a father at all. The name has lost its reality. The semantic link is broken.
So the title must match the behavior or the title is void.
Exactly. Apply that to the prince. If a ruler takes the tax money, builds palaces for himself, and lets the people starve, as was happening during this era, Confucius is subtly arguing that he is no longer a prince. He is just a thief sitting on a throne. So when he says, let the prince be prince, he is not saying obey the tyrant. He is saying the chaos in our society exists because the people holding the titles are refusing to bear the weight of the responsibility.
That completely flips the script. It is an anti-hypocrisy doctrine. It's actually a demand for extreme accountability. If you're going to claim the title of a friend, you must execute the duties of a friend. If you claim the title of a CEO, you must carry the burdens of leadership, not just collect the bonus. Don't just wear the crown. Do the work.
And when every person in the network actually fulfills the definition of their role, when the prince acts like a true prince, and the parent acts like a true parent, society snaps into perfect, frictionless harmony.
That search for integrity, for the alignment of titles and actions, and for internal peace, it isn't just an ancient Chinese political theory. It bleeds into something much more universal. If you look at how he defines a fully actualized person, it sounds incredibly similar to what we find in other global wisdom traditions. Which brings us to the comparative insight we can draw from this text.
Where do you see those global parallels most clearly?
In Book 9, the master summarizes human flourishing in 3 distinct traits. He says, the wise are free from perplexities, the virtuous from anxiety, and the bold from fear. When I read that, it feels like I could be reading Marcus Aurelius in Rome, or a Duda Sutra, or even the goals of modern cognitive behavioral therapy.
It is the ultimate trifecta of human psychological health. Wisdom clears the mind of cognitive confusion. Virtue, as we discussed with Sima Niu, clears the conscience of moral anxiety. And courage clears the body of paralyzing fear. It is a universal baseline for a stable human mind.
But the text doesn't just leave us with abstract definitions of flourishing. It gives us a beautiful narrative picture of what that flourishing actually looks like in practice. There's a story in Book 11 that I think perfectly captures the ultimate goal of all these rigid rules, all this ego eradication, and all this discipline.
The story of the disciples sharing their ambitions. It is easily the most humanizing moment in the entire Analects.
It really is. So the master is sitting informally with 4 of his disciples. They're just relaxing. He asks them a simple question. If a ruler were to know your talents, what would you like to do? Essentially, what is your grandest ambition for your life?
And their answers perfectly reveal the tension of human drive.
Yes. Zulu, who we know is the impulsive, energetic one, immediately jumps in. He says, give me a state of 10 armies, surrounded by enemies and suffering a famine. In 3 years, I'll make the people bold and righteous. He wants to be the ultimate wartime hero, the savior in the crisis.
A very external, high-stress, management-driven ambition.
Then Chu speaks up. He's more measured. He says, give me a smaller state. In 3 years, I can make plenty to abound among the people. He wants to be the genius macroeconomist who solves poverty.
Again, highly ambitious, focused on conquering, managing, and fixing the external world. These are the guys who want to build the ultimate startup or run for president.
But then the master turns to Zhengxi, who has been quietly playing his lute in the background while the others are plotting to conquer the world. The master asks him his ambition. Zhengxi stops playing, sets the instrument aside, and says his wishes are different. He says, in this, the last month of spring, with the dress of the season all complete, along with 5 or 6 young men and 6 or 7 boys, I would wash in the Yi River, enjoy the breeze among the rain altars, and return home singing.
Just bathing in the river with friends, feeling the wind, and singing.
And how does the master respond to this incredible lack of ambition? He heaves a massive sigh and says, I give my approval to Zhengxi.
That sigh carries the weight of the entire philosophy.
It floors me, because it directly mirrors the exact tension we feel today between hustle culture and mindfulness. We all have a Tzu inside of us wanting to conquer the world, manage 10 armies, and fix every broken system. We think that is the goal, but at the end of the day, maybe what the human soul actually craves is Zhengxi's walk by the river.
It connects to a tension found in almost every wisdom tradition in human history. The drive to exert control over the external world versus the profound spiritual necessity of simply harmonizing with nature and community. Confucius spent his entire life teaching rules of governance, diplomacy, tax policy, and strict discipline. But this scene reveals the ultimate purpose of all that exhausting work.
The discipline isn't the end goal itself.
Exactly. The rigid rules, the learning, the obsessive straightening of the mat, the subduing of the self, they are all just scaffolding. They are meant to create a society and a mind so stable, so fundamentally free of anxiety and chaos that you can finally just put down your lute, enjoy the spring breeze, and return home singing. The work, the virtue, the propriety, it's all for the sake of peace.
The rules are the scaffolding. The joy is the building. That is a beautiful synthesis. As we wrap up this deep dive into these specific books, there is one final evocative image from Book 9 that I want to leave you, the listener, with. Something to mull over in your own time as you navigate your own chaos. The master says, when the year becomes cold, Then we know how the pine and the cypress are the last to lose their leaves.
A powerful metric for true character.
It is so easy to be green and vibrant in the spring. It is easy to have virtue when the economy is booming, when you are healthy, when your friends agree with you, and when the wind is at your back. But when the winter of chaos or scarcity or personal hardship hits your life, what are the internal leaves you will retain and what will fall away? Are you building a character made of pine and cypress, something with a deep structural integrity to stay green in the frost? That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.